I'm Scott Lucas. This is EAWorldView on Syria. Today, how the media's obsession with extremism is leading to bad coverage. We've spoken often on EAWorldView about how the media resorts to simple labels, say like al-Qaeda, 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 to distort very complex conflicts, whether that's in the Middle East, North Africa, or Pakistan. We talked about how headlines that focus solely on extremist or jihadist don't begin to represent the political, social, and military issues. Recently, we've carried stories on EAWorldView about the Syrian conflict in which the insurgency, say in the battle for Menach Air Base in Aleppo, has been reduced to a tale of extremist jihadists who are leading the fight. We've also written about how the very complex situation in the city of Raqqa, the largest one controlled by the insurgency, has been reduced to a tale of a foreign faction, the Islamic State of Iraq, and how they are supposedly dominating the entire opposition movement. Links to those stories can be found here. But today, I want to talk to you about 3 cases in the past week. Cases which show how the media is not only distorting, but sometimes falsifying the conflict for the sake of a sensational headline. Case number 1, the insurgents who execute soldiers. Last week, a well-known correspondent, C.J. Chivers of the New York Times, published a graphic report, a report which he said showed in April 2013 how fighters from a key faction in the insurgency had captured and shot in the head 7 insurgent soldiers. Chivers featured a video which he said had been given to him by a defector from the opposition. The overall headline in the New York Times, and Chivers' own words, said, "Graphic video shows problems of supporting insurgency in the Syrian conflict." Seems to be a very key story, right? Well, here's the problem. The video that Chivers featured is not from April 2013. It is from April 2012, almost a year and a half ago. And the fighters that he featured carrying out the executions are not from a key insurgent faction. They're from a small independent group of less than 300 fighters, a group which, contrary to what was said by the Times, does not have links to the Supreme Military Command, the overall supervisor of the insurgency. The Times later published a partial retraction, giving the correct date for the video, but it did not withdraw its main story, a story that was published at a time when the United States was considering not only military airstrikes against the Assad regime over chemical weapons attacks, but considering whether to give arms to Syria's insurgents. Case 2, the battle for a Christian city. This week, the New York Times featured a different page 1 stunning headline: "Extremist jihadists overrun Christian town of Malula, northeast of Damascus." The story the Times claimed was how these extremist jihadists, code for a faction named Jabhat al-Nusra, had moved into the town of Malula, renowned for being a site of ancient Christianity where residents still spoke Aramaic, the original language of Christ. In fact, the Times' own information did nothing to support that headline. The only witness from Malula quoted was a nun who said that, in fact, the fighters who had taken over the town included local men, and that far from attacking Christians, they had promised to protect churches, convents, and homes. The New York Times story also referenced numerous videos, some of them propaganda videos, but some of them records of what happened in the town, which showed insurgents indeed promising not to attack the residents, but to make sure that they were safe. The only source in the story that gave any indication that there was a threat was a person in Damascus, the leader of a pro-regime group, who said that in fact there had been threats made against the residents, forcing them to flee. Once again, however, these details could be swept aside. Look to the headline, and the story was, "If you support the insurgency, you support extremist jihadists who will threaten and perhaps kill Christians." But it's not only on the side of the insurgency that we get the misleading coverage of extremists. It also happens on the side of the Syrian forces. Consider example 3, the Iranians who are directing the fight for Damascus. This week, Al-Jazeera English featured a dramatic video of just over 2 minutes. A video which it claimed showed Iranians directing Syrian forces, and indeed Iranian fighters fighting alongside. The video, which had been dubbed into English, covered up the original soundtrack of the fighters, but in fact from their uniforms and from the sounds that could be made out, they weren't speaking Persian, they were speaking Arabic. None of the fighters who were shown on this supposed military base, whether involved in communications or in training, were Iranian. They appeared to be Syrian army forces. There was one Iranian who was in the clip. He was identified as an Iranian fighter named Ismail Hadari. But in fact, Ismail Hadari is not an Iranian fighter. As we reported on EA last month, linked to the story below, Ismail Hadari was a documentary maker who was filming the Syrian conflict when he was killed near Damascus on the 22nd of August. His funeral was in Iran a few days later. So what happened? Why did Al-Jazeera English publish a story in which the only Iranian who appeared, driving in a car, speaking to camera, was not a fighter, was definitely not a commander, but was a filmmaker? Al-Jazeera English was given the video by an opposition brigade who said they had captured it in fighting. But what the opposition brigade in fact had was Haidari's unfinished film. Whether it was the opposition or whether it was Al-Jazeera English who then carried out the translation of the footage, the finished product was a complete distortion of that documentary, turning it from being a record of one Iranian observing the Syrian conflict into Iranians controlling it. Is there a lesson here? Yes, and it's a straightforward one. Whether it's the search for headlines, whether it is taking a side in the conflict, key media outlets, New York Times, Al Jazeera English, and others we have covered, such as the Washington Post, have reduced this conflict of being different evils. There's the evil Assad regime, with the Iranians supporting it, and there are the evil extremist jihadists, some of whom are linked to al-Qaeda. It is a caricature, which gets us no closer to understanding what is going on, much less what we should do about it. I'm Scott Lucas, and this has been EA's Worldview on Syria for today.